In the summer of 1966, a terrifying political storm erupted across China that would wage war not against a foreign invader, but against history itself. This was the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution, a decade-long upheaval initiated by Mao Zedong to purge the country of feudal elements and enforce strict ideological purity. The foot soldiers of this movement were the Red Guards, millions of zealous students and teenagers who were encouraged to destroy the four olds: old customs, old culture, old habits, and old ideas. Architecture, specifically religious architecture, became the primary physical enemy. Across the vast nation, from the ancient capital of Beijing to the remote cliffs of the Silk Road, thousands of temples, monasteries, and ancestral shrines were targeted. These were not merely closed down, they were violently dismantled, burned, and defaced. The tragedy we explore today is not about a single building, but about a systematic, nationwide architectural pogrom. It is the story of how the Cave of Monks, a metaphor for the secluded, sacred spaces of Buddhism and Taoism, was pried open and smashed, leaving behind headless statues and empty grottos as permanent scars on the face of Chinese civilization. This was an attempt to lobotomize the collective memory of a nation by pulverizing its stone skeleton. The visual legacy of this era is hauntingly specific: the headless statue. In cave temples like the Longmen Grottoes or the disparate shrines of Sichuan, Red Guards would go to extraordinary lengths to climb scaffolding or scale cliffs simply to smash the faces and heads of stone Buddhas. This was a ritualistic act of architectural decapitation, a symbolic killing of the deity and the history it represented. The destruction was not random vandalism, it was a highly organized political performance. In many cases, the destruction of a temple was accompanied by struggle sessions, where monks were forced to watch their sacred texts burn before being publicly humiliated or beaten. The architecture was treated as a living political criminal. The sheer scale of this vanished grandeur is almost impossible to quantify. Estimates suggest that in Beijing alone, 4,922 out of 6,843 places of cultural or historical interest were destroyed in the chaotic months of August and September 1966. We are looking at an event where the architectural heritage of 5,000 years was brought to the brink of total extinction in less than 10 years. A period of ideological prescription that turned the country's most beautiful sanctuaries into rubble and dust. Welcome back to Vanished Grandeur, where we investigate the tragic intersection of politics, ideology, and architecture. Today's episode is perhaps the most harrowing example of forbidden architecture, because the ban was absolute and enforced by the population itself. The ideology of the Four Olds meant that any physical structure reflecting China's imperial, feudal, or religious past was considered a poison to the new socialist spirit. Temples were not seen as art, they were seen as chains binding the people to superstition. This worldview justified the obliteration of priceless timber frame halls, delicate pagodas, and rock-carved reliefs that had survived wars and weather for a millennium. We will focus on the specific tragedy of the cave temples and the great monasteries, places like the White Horse Temple and the Confucian sites in Khufu, which served as the repositories of Chinese philosophy and art. The destruction of these sites was an act of cultural suicide, where a civilization declared war on its own greatest achievements, believing that the new world could only be built on the pulverized ashes of the old. The architectural targets were diverse, ranging from the grand imperial temples to the humble village earth god shrines. However, the Buddhist and Taoist monasteries bore the brunt of the violence because they were institutionally organized and physically prominent. The Cave of Monks refers to the ancient tradition of carving temples directly into rock faces, a practice imported from India via the Silk Road. These sites, such as the Longmen and Grottoes, contained tens of thousands of statues. While some, like the Mogao Caves in Dunhung, were miraculously protected by the direct intervention of Premier Zhu Enlai, who ordered the PLA to guard them, countless others were undefended. The Red Guards, armed with sledgehammers, dynamite, and revolutionary fervor, descended upon these undefended sites. They didn't just knock down walls, they scraped frescoes off the rock, burned ancient sutras, scriptures in massive bonfires, and melted down bronze statues for scrap metal. The vanished grandeur here is the loss of the intricate spiritual ecosystem that defined the Chinese landscape, replaced by a barren, secular void that lasted for decades. The White Horse Temple, Baima Si in Luoyang, is traditionally regarded as the cradle of Chinese Buddhism, the first Buddhist temple established in China in 68 AD. It was a site of immense historical significance, a pilgrimage destination for nearly 2,000 years. During the Cultural Revolution, it became a prime target. Red Guards from the local agricultural machinery school stormed the complex. They smashed the more than 1,000-year-old statues of the 18 Arhats, masterpieces of the Yuan dynasty, made of dry lacquer and cloth, reducing them to unrecognizable debris. They dragged the ancient scriptures into the courtyard and set them ablaze. Most heartbreakingly, they took the temple's iconic white horse statues, symbols of the arrival of Buddhism, and smashed them. The monks were driven out or forced to desecrate their own vows. The temple buildings were seized and converted into production brigade headquarters, stripping the architecture of its sanctity. The architectural proscription here was total. The physical shell remained, but its soul, the art and the community, was violently excised. Perhaps the most shocking act of architectural violence occurred in Khufu, the hometown of Confucius. For over 2,000 years, the Temple of Confucius and the cemetery of the Kong family were sacred ground, respected by every dynasty as the moral center of the nation. In November 1966, Red Guards from Beijing, led by a leader named Tan Holan, traveled to Khufu to rebel against the sage. They spent weeks systematically destroying the site. They smashed massive stone steels that recorded imperial grants and history, creating a field of broken stone. They broke into the cemetery of Confucius, dug up the graves of the Kong descendants, and hung the naked corpses of the 76th Duke Yansheng and his wife from a tree in a grotesque act of posthumous humiliation. They even attempted to dynamite the tomb of Confucius himself. This was not just property damage, it was an attempt to physically murder the philosophical ancestor of Chinese culture. The architecture of the temple complex, with its yellow glazed tiles and red walls, was defaced with revolutionary slogans, transforming a monument of order into a theater of chaos. The Longmen Grottoes, a UNESCO World Heritage Site today, features some of the finest examples of Chinese Buddhist art, carved into the limestone cliffs of the Yi River. While the site had suffered from looting by Western collectors in the early 20th century, the Cultural Revolution brought a new, ideological wave of destruction. Local Red Guards, seeing the thousands of stone Buddhas as ghosts and monsters, climbed the cliffs to carry out their work. Evidence of their vandalism is still visible today. Thousands of statues are missing hands, noses, or entire heads. The faces of the bodhisattvas, once serene and compassionate, were chipped away to leave jagged, blank scars. This was labor-intensive destruction. It required physical effort to ruin stone carvings that had stood since the Northern Wei and Tang dynasties. The vanished grandeur of Longmen is the loss of the face of history. The detailed expressions of the past were literally erased by the chisels of the present. The destruction in Tibet was particularly catastrophic, merging the ideological crusade of the Cultural Revolution with the suppression of Tibetan cultural identity. Before 1959, there were over 6,000 monasteries in Tibet. By the end of the Cultural Revolution, only a handful remained intact. Great architectural complexes like the Ganden Monastery, one of the great three Gelug University monasteries, were reduced to shell-shocked ruins. The Red Guards, often supported by the army, bombarded the thick stone walls of the monasteries as if they were military fortresses. The intricate Thangka paintings, wooden carvings, and golden statues were looted or burned. The buildings were then dismantled, stone by the local population, who were often forced to participate in the destruction of their own heritage. The architectural landscape of the Tibetan Plateau was fundamentally altered, turning a land of mountaintop citadels into a land of ruins. The Famen Temple in Shanxi Province, famous for housing a fingerbone relic of the Buddha, faced a dramatic siege. When the Red Guards arrived to destroy the temple and dig up the relic, the abbot, Liang King, realized he could not stop them with words. In a desperate act of architectural martyrdom, he soaked himself in kerosene and set himself on fire in front of the true relic pagoda. His self-immolation horrified the Red Guards enough to temporarily halt their advance and arguably saved the underground palace, rediscovered in 1987, from being looted at that moment. However, the surface buildings were largely wrecked. This story highlights the intense human connection to this architecture. For the monks, the temple was not just a building, but the physical body of the Dharma, worth dying to protect. Liang King's sacrifice is a tragic testament to the severity of the prescription placed upon these holy sites. Not all temples were physically leveled. Many were subjected to a form of architectural repurposing that was equally destructive to their identity. Across China, temples were confiscated and turned into factories, grain depots, barracks, or schools. The high ceilings of the main halls were ideal for machinery or storage. To adapt the spaces, the superstitious elements, statues, altars, incense burners, were removed and smashed. The walls, often covered in centuries-old frescoes, were whitewashed or plastered over with slogans quoting Chairman Mao. This adaptive reuse was a form of humiliation for the building. A space designed for silence and meditation became a space of noise and industrial production. The vanished grandeur was the loss of the sacred atmosphere. The shell remained, but the spirit was evicted, and the building was forced to serve the very ideology that sought to destroy it. The true scale of the loss is not just in the buildings, but in the movable art they housed. China's monasteries were essentially the country's art museums, holding collections of calligraphy, painting, porcelain, and sculpture accumulated over centuries. The Four Olds campaign resulted in the greatest destruction of art in human history. Bonfires of scrolls and woodblock prints burned for days in the courtyards of Beijing and Shanghai. This was the deletion of the country's intellectual software. The architectural void left by the empty niches in the temples mirrors the cultural void left by the destruction of these artifacts. We will never know exactly what was lost because the inventory records were often burned along with the objects. It was a total system reset that deleted the backups of Chinese civilization. Amidst the carnage, the survival of the Forbidden City in Beijing stands as a miraculous exception, illustrating the internal conflict within the communist leadership. When Red Guards gathered at the gates, intending to storm the imperial palace and smash it as the ultimate symbol of feudalism, Premier Zhou Enlai intervened. He ordered the gates to be shut and deployed troops to protect the complex. This act saved the world's largest wooden architectural complex. It proves that the destruction was not inevitable, it was permitted. The survival of the Forbidden City highlights the tragedy of the thousands of other sites that did not have a high-ranking protector, showing that the architectural proscription was selective and chaotic, dependent on the whims of political power struggles. In the decades following the death of Mao and the end of the Cultural Revolution, China embarked on a massive program of rebuilding. However, this created a new architectural problem: the rise of fake antiquities. Many destroyed temples were rebuilt using modern concrete and flashy, bright paints, lacking the subtlety and craftsmanship of the originals. These replicas often function more as tourist attractions than spiritual centers. The vanished grandeur of the original wood and stone structures, with their patina of age, cannot be replicated. The new buildings are architectural zombies. They look like the old temples, but they lack the historical continuity and the material soul of the structures that were lost. The Disneyfication of religious sites is the secondary tragedy that followed the initial destruction. The physical reconstruction was accompanied by a slow revival of religious practice. Monks were allowed to return, often to ruins, to begin the painstaking process of clearing rubble and rebuilding shrines. In many cases, the restoration was funded by donations from overseas Chinese or foreign Buddhist organizations. This human resilience is remarkable. The cave of monks is being inhabited again, but the lineage was broken. The old masters were dead or laicized, and the oral traditions of temple construction and ritual were interrupted. The current generation is trying to reconstruct a tradition from books and memories, living in reconstructed architecture that serves as a monument to their perseverance against political erasure. Today, technology offers a way to virtually undo the damage. Projects are underway to digitally scan the headless statues of Longmen and other sites and virtually restore the missing faces using data from old photographs and stylistic analysis. This digital anastylosis allows visitors to see the grandeur that was lost through augmented reality apps on their phones. While it cannot bring back the stone, it can lift the ban on seeing the art as it was intended. This digital layer acts as a ghost of the past, hovering over the scarred physical reality, bridging the gap between the Cultural Revolution's destruction and the modern desire for heritage. There's a growing debate in China about how much to restore. Some argue that the damage inflicted by the Red Guards is now, paradoxically, a part of the history of the site. The smashed faces and defaced steels are historical evidence of the 20th century's turbulence. To fully repair them would be to erase the history of the Cultural Revolution, just as the Red Guards tried to erase the history of the empire. The scars are now part of the architectural identity of these places. They serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of ideological extremism. The Cave of Monks is now a double monument, one to the devotion of the ancients and one to the madness of the moderns. There's a growing debate in China about how much to restore. Some argue that the damage inflicted by the Red Guards is now, paradoxically, a part of the history of the site. The smashed faces and defaced steels are historical evidence of the 20th century's turbulence. To fully repair them would be to erase the history of the Cultural Revolution, just as the Red Guards tried to erase the history of the empire. The scars are now part of the architectural identity of these places. They serve as a permanent warning about the dangers of ideological extremism. The Cave of Monks is now a double monument, one to the devotion of the ancients and one to the madness of the moderns. The emptiness where statues once stood and the charred outlines of lost pagodas are the enduring legacy of the Four Olds campaign. While the Communist Party later repudiated the Cultural Revolution and sponsored Reconstruction, the gap in the historical record is permanent. The vanished grandeur of the original structures represents a break in the chain of Chinese civilization. The headless Buddhas of Longmen gaze out over the river, blind witnesses to a time when beauty was considered a crime. The Cave of Monks teaches us a terrifying lesson. Stone is hard, but ideology is harder. We often assume architecture endures because it is solid, but the Cultural Revolution proved that even mountains can be chiseled away by the persistence of hatred. Yet the eventual revival of these sites also proves that the human need for the sacred and for connection to the past is resilient. The temples were smashed, but the faith that built them survived the rubble, slowly rebuilding the forbidden sanctuaries, one brick at a time. The scars on China's temples are a stark reminder that the most dangerous enemy of architecture is often the very society that inherited it. If you were shocked by this account of the Cave of Monks and the systematic war on history, be sure to subscribe to Vanished Grandeur and share your thoughts. Should the damaged statues be fully restored or left broken as a lesson? Our next episode travels to Europe to explore a different kind of destruction, one driven by modernization in urban hygiene. The Paris Les Halles, how the belly of Paris gave way to modernity. We will investigate the tragic demolition of the magnificent 19th-century iron and glass market pavilions of Victor Baltard and how their replacement became one of the most hated architectural projects in French history. What other historic markets lost to progress should we cover? Let us know in the comments.